At 7:30 on the cold, rain-soaked morning of October 24, 1944, Technical Sergeant Charles Culage crouched beneath the dripping branches of pine trees in the Vosges forest east of Belmont-sur-Button. Water ran steadily from the needles above him, sliding down the back of his helmet and collar as he studied the fog-filled woods ahead. Somewhere out there, hidden in the gray forest, German soldiers were waiting. Culage was 23 years old and already a veteran of 14 straight months of combat. Salerno, San Pietro, the Rapido River, Anzio, Monte Cassino, Rome. The 36th Infantry Division had bled its way across Italy, and Culage had survived every mile of it. The worst moment had come months earlier at the Rapido River in January 1944. The division had been ordered to force a crossing against heavily fortified German defenses. Within 48 hours, the riverbanks were filled with wounded men and burning equipment. Nearly 2,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire rifle companies disappeared. The disaster would later trigger congressional investigations back home. Generals blamed each other for the catastrophe. None of that mattered to Culage. He had simply survived. Now the war had carried him to France. The 36th Division had landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon in August 1944. Since then, they had pushed steadily north up the Rhone Valley toward Germany. By late October, they had reached the rugged Vosges Mountains, a landscape of steep ridges, thick forests, freezing rain, and German defensive positions hidden on every hill. This was a soldier's nightmare. Culage commanded a section of heavy machine guns, water-cooled, 30-caliber Browning weapons capable of firing continuously for long periods without overheating. In the right position, they could tear apart an advancing infantry force. He had been attached to Company K and ordered to cover the right flank of the 3rd Battalion near Hill 623. The mission itself wasn't the problem. The problem was the men. 12 soldiers stood under his command that morning, and most of them had arrived as replacements less than 2 weeks earlier. They had completed basic training. They had crossed the Atlantic on crowded troop transports. They had been sent straight to the front to replace men killed during the division's advance through France. None of them had ever been in combat. There were no officers on Hill 623, no lieutenant, no captain. The highest-ranking American on that hill was Technical Sergeant Charles Culage, a quiet man from Signal Mountain, Tennessee, who before the war had worked in his family's printing business. He had been drafted in June 1942 and had never asked for promotion beyond sergeant. Now, whether he wanted it or not, he was in command. The Vosges campaign was draining the American army. Rifle companies throughout the 36th Division had been reduced to half strength, or worse. A company that should have had 180 men sometimes fielded barely 70. Platoons designed for 40 soldiers fought with 15. Replacements were shipped into the line as fast as transport ships could deliver them. Many lasted only days. The casualty rates were not random. The Germans knew these mountains intimately. Every ridge was fortified. Machine guns covered every approach. Mortar crews had already measured the range to every clearing and trail. American units that advanced without careful reconnaissance often walked straight into carefully prepared kill zones. Culage understood that better than most. He had already earned a Silver Star in Italy for actions under fire. He knew exactly what German machine guns could do to men caught in the open. And he knew that inexperienced soldiers made deadly mistakes. That morning, Culage took another sergeant from Company K and moved forward through the wet forest to scout possible machine gun positions. Before committing his inexperienced men to the defense of the hill, he needed to see the terrain for himself. They advanced cautiously through the fog and rain. And then everything went wrong. Moving quietly between the trees, Culage and the sergeant suddenly stepped into a German position. Not a patrol, not a listening post. An entire German infantry company, nearly 150 soldiers, dug into prepared fighting positions with overlapping fields of fire. The Germans spotted them instantly. Culage had perhaps 2 seconds to decide what to do. He could run. He could surrender. Or he could attempt something so reckless that no military manual had ever considered it. He chose the third option. Standing in the open with nothing but a carbine rifle in his hands, Technical Sergeant Charles Culage demanded that the entire German company surrender to him. The Germans stared at him in disbelief. Then they raised their weapons. One American sergeant stood facing 150 enemy soldiers. The distance between them was measured in yards. Culage did not run. He did not drop his weapon. Instead, he raised his carbine, aimed at the nearest German soldiers, and fired. 2 Germans went down before the entire company opened fire. The forest exploded. Rifle bullets snapped through the branches. Machine pistol bursts shredded the air. Somewhere in the line, a MG-42 machine gun roared to life. Culage and the company case sergeant turned and sprinted through the trees toward their position on Hill 623. Bullets cracked past their heads. Bark exploded from tree trunks. The Germans had already begun pursuing them, trying to overrun the American hilltop before the defenders could organize. Culage reached his men seconds later. What he saw almost stopped him. The replacements had heard the gunfire. Several stood frozen in place. Others looked at one another helplessly, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. A few had already begun edging backward. They had trained for this moment in quiet stateside camps. They had practiced fire and movement drills on dusty training fields. But nothing prepares a man for the sound of real bullets passing close enough to hear. Culage didn't have time to explain. The Germans were coming. He could hear them moving through the forest, shouting commands. Maybe 90 seconds before they reached the American line. Maybe less. Culage did not run. He walked. Calmly moving along the line of frightened soldiers, he spoke in an even voice, pointing to positions, adjusting fields of fire, correcting the placement of the heavy machine guns. Riflemen were placed to protect the gun crews. Each man was assigned a sector of fire. Above them, bullets slammed into the trees. The MG-42 ripped bursts that sounded like tearing canvas. Mortar rounds began falling somewhere off to the left. Still, Culage kept walking. The heavy Brownings were his only real advantage. The German MG-42 fired faster, but its barrel overheated quickly and required frequent changes. The American water-cooled Browning machine guns could fire almost continuously. If the crews stayed steady, if they followed his orders, if they didn't panic, they could stop the assault. Moments later, the first German attack emerged through the trees like a gray wave. Experienced infantrymen advanced in short rushes, covering one another, using every tree and fold of ground for protection. These were professional soldiers, men who had been fighting since Poland in 1939. They knew exactly how to destroy a small American position defended by inexperienced troops. Culage shouted the order. The Brownings opened fire. The effect was immediate. German soldiers collapsed. Others dove for cover. The assault stalled barely 20 yards from the American line. For a moment, the firing slowed as the Germans pulled back to regroup. They had expected frightened replacements. They had expected an easy victory. Instead, they had encountered precise, disciplined machine gun fire. 15 minutes later, they attacked again. Different direction, different approach. The result was the same. The Brownings cut them down before they could reach the hilltop. By midday on October 24th, the German company had launched 4 separate assaults against Hill 623. Each one had failed. The forest floor in front of the American position was now scattered with German casualties. But Culage understood the mathematics of war. The Germans had started with roughly 150 men. Perhaps 20 had fallen so far. That still left them outnumbering his force by more than 10 to 1. They would not stop. They would probe for weaknesses. They would attempt to flank the hill. They might even bring up reinforcements. His ammunition was limited. His men were exhausted. Several replacements had fought bravely once the shooting began, but the psychological strain of continuous combat was beginning to show. Men who fought well in the morning sometimes broke by nightfall. The cold rain continued to fall. Temperatures dropped toward freezing. The Vosges forest slowly transformed into a nightmare of mud, fog, and scattered gunfire. And the battle for Hill 623 had only just begun. Culage and his men had survived the first day. Against all expectations, the inexperienced soldiers on Hill 623 had endured their baptism of fire without losing a single American. But the battle was far from over. The Germans were still out there in the dark forest, regrouping, planning, waiting for night to hide their next attack. As darkness settled over the hill on October 24th, German officers somewhere among the trees were studying maps and counting casualties. The American position had proven stronger than expected, but it was still small, isolated, and surrounded. Culage knew what that meant. The enemy would return. He posted sentries, checked the remaining ammunition for the machine guns, and prepared his men for a long night. Dawn was still 8 hours away. The Germans had plenty of time to plan. The night passed in a tense, frozen silence, occasionally broken by scattered gunfire. Shortly before midnight, German patrols approached the American perimeter twice, cautiously probing the defenses. Each time, Culage answered with short, controlled bursts from the Browning machine guns. The sharp rattle of gunfire tore through the darkness and forced the Germans back into the trees. No one on Hill 623 slept. The temperature dropped below 40 degrees. Rain turned briefly into sleet before falling again as cold water that soaked uniforms already stiff with mud and sweat. The soldiers huddled in their foxholes had no chance to build fires. Their clothes could not dry. The cold slowly worked its way through wool and cotton until it reached bone. Throughout the night, Culage moved quietly between positions. He checked ammunition belts. He spoke softly with sentries to keep them alert. And he reassured young soldiers experiencing combat for the first time. Many of them were learning a truth about war no training field had ever mentioned. Combat was mostly waiting. Waiting in the cold. Waiting in the darkness. Waiting for something terrible to happen. Morning came on October 25th with a thick fog that swallowed the forest. Trees disappeared beyond 30 yards, and visibility shrank to almost nothing. The Germans used the fog immediately. The first attack came without warning. There was no preparatory artillery, no visible movement, just gray shapes suddenly appearing out of gray mist, already close enough to throw grenades when the American sentry finally spotted them. Culage reacted instantly. He had prepared for exactly this situation. The machine guns had been positioned with overlapping fields of fire that created a deadly crossfire zone, even in poor visibility. The Brownings erupted. Streams of tracers vanished into the fog. German soldiers dropped where they stood. The attack collapsed in less than 2 minutes. But the Germans had learned something important. They had measured the American reaction time. They had identified the locations of several machine guns by the flashes from their muzzles. They were gathering information. The second attack came from a different direction. During the night, German soldiers had maneuvered through the forest, circling east in search of a weak point in the American defenses. They found one. A narrow seam between two machine gun positions. German infantry poured through the gap. The fighting suddenly became close and chaotic. Riflemen fired at shapes appearing through the fog. German stick grenades exploded among the trees. For nearly 90 seconds, Hill 623 dissolved into confusion where soldiers could identify friend from enemy only by the sound of their weapons. Culage grabbed his carbine and ran toward the breach. Inside the American perimeter, he found 3 German soldiers moving behind the lines toward one of the machine gun crews. Culage fired instantly. 1 German fell dead. Another dropped wounded. The third disappeared back into the fog. The gap in the line was sealed. The attack collapsed. But the cost was visible. 2 of Culage's men had been wounded. Their injuries were not life-threatening, but they were serious enough to reduce their ability to fight. The small American force had just become smaller. The afternoon brought 3 more attacks. Each was smaller than the morning assaults. Each approached from a slightly different direction. The Germans were probing carefully, testing every part of the perimeter. They were searching for weakness. They did not find it. By nightfall on October 25th, Culage and his men had been fighting for 36 straight hours. They had repelled at least 8 separate assaults. But the situation was becoming more dangerous. Ammunition was running low. The 2 wounded soldiers needed evacuation that was impossible while German troops surrounded the hill. The numbers still favored the enemy. The German company had suffered heavy losses, perhaps 30 or 40 dead or wounded, but they were receiving reinforcements. Culage could hear the evidence in the distance. Engines, voices, vehicles moving somewhere beyond the forest. The enemy was growing stronger while his own force slowly weakened. That night, American artillery finally began firing harassment rounds into the German rear areas. Shells passed overhead with a roar like freight trains before detonating beyond the tree line. Each explosion briefly lit the fog with flashes of white light. Culage used those brief moments of illumination to check his positions once again. His men were exhausted, frozen, running low on ammunition, but they were still holding. One problem remained. Culage had no communication with battalion headquarters. His radio had failed during the first day of fighting. Behind the American lines, no one knew whether Hill 623 was still holding or had already been overrun. Without communication, no relief force could be sent. No officer could authorize reinforcements for a position that might already have been destroyed. October 26th would bring the third day of battle. Culage carefully counted the remaining ammunition. Then he calculated how many more assaults his men could repel. The answer was not encouraging. Somewhere in the darkness, German commanders were reaching the same conclusion. 3 days of infantry attacks had failed. Hill 623 would not fall to persistence alone. They needed something heavier. Morning came on October 26th with a new sound. Mortars. The Germans had changed tactics. Instead of rushing through the fog, shells began falling across the American position at first light. Explosions crept methodically across the hilltop as the mortar crews adjusted their aim. Airburst rounds detonated high in the trees, scattering fragments downward into foxholes. Culage ordered his men deeper into their fighting positions. The mortars were not meant to destroy the defenses. They were meant to break the defenders. Keep them pinned. Keep them afraid. Soften them for the final attack. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes. When it stopped, the sudden silence felt almost painful. Then the Germans came again. This attack was larger and far more organized. Reinforcements had arrived overnight. Fresh soldiers who had not spent 2 days bleeding against American machine guns now advanced through the forest using coordinated fire and movement. Culage watched them approach. His carbine had perhaps 40 rounds remaining. The machine guns held enough ammunition for maybe 2 more sustained engagements. After that, the defense of Hill 623 would depend on rifles, pistols, and whatever weapons could be taken from the enemy dead. The Brownings opened fire. German soldiers fell, but more kept coming. The volume of return fire was heavier than anything the previous 2 days had produced. Bullets hammered the logs protecting the machine gun positions. Splinters and bark exploded through the air. Suddenly, one of the Browning guns fell silent. The weapon had jammed. The assistant gunner struggled frantically to clear the malfunction. A belt of ammunition had twisted during feeding. Under normal circumstances, it was a simple problem. Under fire, it became a matter of life and death. Culage sprinted across the position. He grabbed the weapon, worked the mechanism, and cleared the jam in seconds. Years of training had made the motion automatic. The machine gun roared back to life. Once again, the German assault faltered. But the pattern was becoming obvious. Each attack pushed closer to the American line. Each lasted longer before breaking. Each left more German dead in the forest. And each one consumed more of the Americans' precious ammunition. By midday, Culage faced the truth. 4 of his men were now wounded. All of them were still fighting. His ammunition could sustain perhaps 2 more major assaults. His soldiers had been awake for over 60 hours with only moments of rest. The Germans had suffered even heavier casualties, perhaps 50 or 60 men, but they continued receiving reinforcements. They had numbers. They could afford losses. Culage had 12 men on a hilltop, and no relief was coming. Then, late in the afternoon of October 26th, something strange happened. The German attacks stopped. The forest fell completely silent. No probing fire. No patrols. Nothing. Culage recognized the silence immediately. He had seen it before in Italy. The Germans only paused their assaults when they were preparing something decisive, when they were bringing forward weapons that would change the battle. He sent 2 men forward as scouts. They returned within the hour. The news confirmed his worst fear. Vehicles were moving in the German rear. Not trucks. Something heavier. The scouts had heard the unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles grinding through the forest. The metallic clank of tank treads on frozen ground. Infantry alone had failed to break Hill 623. Now the Germans were bringing armor. Machine guns alone had failed to drive the Americans from Hill 623. But tanks changed everything. A single armored vehicle could ignore machine gun fire almost completely. Its thick steel armor would absorb the bullets while its main gun methodically destroyed each American fighting position. 2 tanks would make the process faster. Culage had only one weapon capable of stopping armor. A single bazooka. The M1 rocket launcher was theoretically capable of penetrating German tank armor at close range. Theoretically. In reality, bazookas were unpredictable weapons. Rockets sometimes failed to detonate. Launchers misfired. Even a direct hit did not always destroy a tank. That was all Culage had. Night fell over Hill 623 on October 26th, somewhere beyond the dark tree line. Tank engines idled quietly in the forest. German infantry rested nearby, confident that the next day's attack would unfold differently. For 3 days they had died in front of American machine guns. Tomorrow they would advance behind steel. Culage inspected the bazooka one more time. 1 launcher, 3 rockets, and a decision that would determine whether his men lived or died when morning came. Dawn arrived on October 27, 1944. The 4th day. Culage had not slept in more than 70 hours. His men had managed only brief moments of exhausted unconsciousness in their foxholes. True rest was impossible. The cold prevented it. The fear prevented it. And the knowledge that German tanks were somewhere in the forest waiting to attack prevented it. That morning the fog was thinner than on previous days. Visibility stretched farther, 50 yards, then 60. Culage could see the tree line, where German infantry had attacked for 3 straight days. He could see bodies still lying among the wet leaves. And he could see the narrow approach route the tanks would likely use. He heard them before he saw them. A grinding metallic sound. Heavy engines straining. The unmistakable noise of armored vehicles forcing their way through dense forest. Not 1 engine. 2. German infantry appeared first. They moved cautiously along the tree line, staying under cover while waiting for the armor to clear a path forward. These soldiers carried themselves differently from the assault troops of the previous days. They moved with patience, with confidence. They knew what was coming behind them. Then the tanks emerged. 2 German armored vehicles rolled out of the fog and into the clearing below Hill 623. Their turrets moved slowly from side to side, scanning for targets. Machine guns mounted in the hull and turret added even more firepower. Each tank carried enough ammunition to fight for hours. Culage watched them advance. His Browning machine guns were useless against armor. Those water-cooled guns had shattered every infantry assault for 3 days, but against steel plating they were meaningless. The bullets would bounce off like rain striking a roof. The bazooka was his only option. The weapon required close range to be effective. 50 yards was optimistic. 25 yards was realistic. To stop those tanks, Culage would have to leave the protection of his position and move toward the enemy in the open while German infantry covered the advance. He checked the launcher one more time. The electrical firing system appeared functional. 3 rockets remained. Everything that could be inspected had been inspected. The tanks kept coming. Behind them, German infantry began spreading into formation. This was the attack the previous 3 days had been building toward. Armor and infantry working together, each covering the other's weaknesses. Culage's machine gunners looked toward him. These young soldiers had held the hill against impossible odds. They had survived their first combat and fought with discipline beyond their experience. Now they faced tanks, and their only hope was a single bazooka and a sergeant from Tennessee. The German formation closed steadily. 100 yards. 80 yards. The tanks advanced slowly, their commanders certain the American defense would collapse. At 60 yards the lead tank stopped. Its turret hatch opened. A German officer rose from the cupola, clearly visible above the armored turret. He called out toward the American position. The officer spoke fluent English. He demanded that the Americans surrender. He explained the situation calmly. 2 tanks. Infantry. Overwhelming force. Resistance was pointless. If they surrendered now, he promised, they would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Culage stood up from his foxhole. His men watched silently. For 4 days their sergeant had kept them alive against impossible odds. Now he answered the German commander. His reply was short, clear, and defiant. He refused. The German officer stared at him for a moment. Then he dropped back into the turret and slammed the hatch shut. The tank lurched forward. The infantry began advancing. Culage grabbed the bazooka. He checked the rocket one final time. Then he climbed out of his foxhole and started walking toward the tanks. Not running. Walking. The same steady pace he had used for 4 days while enemy fire cracked through the trees around him. The same calm movement that had kept his men from panicking when panic would have been natural. 25 yards. That was the distance he needed. 25 yards from a moving German tank. The gap closed step by step. German machine guns opened fire the moment Culage left his position. Bullets slashed through the air around him. Tracers streaked past, like burning insects. The German infantry behind the tanks immediately understood what he intended. They focused their fire on the lone American sergeant advancing with a rocket launcher. Culage kept walking. 40 yards. 35. 30. The bazooka felt heavy across his shoulder. The rocket inside it represented the only chance to stop the armored vehicles that would otherwise crush his position and kill every man on the hill. 25 yards. Culage dropped to one knee. He raised the launcher to his shoulder. He aimed at the sloped front armor of the lead tank. And he pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The electrical ignition system had failed. The rocket remained motionless inside the launcher. The weapon produced nothing but a hollow click. Culage pulled the trigger again. Another click. The bazooka was dead. He threw the useless launcher aside. For a moment he knelt in the open, 25 yards from a German tank, with no weapon capable of stopping it. Machine gun fire snapped through the air around him. The tank's turret slowly turned toward his position. German infantry advanced behind the armor. Most men would have run. Most would have sprinted back toward their foxholes, hoping to reach cover before the tank's gunner found the range. Most would have accepted that the situation was hopeless. Culage did not run. Instead, he began gathering grenades. Every fragmentation grenade he could carry. Grenades from his own equipment. Grenades taken from wounded soldiers during the battle. Grenades scavenged from German bodies after earlier assaults. His pockets filled with explosives. Then he dropped to the ground and began crawling forward. The tank's machine gun opened fire. Bullets tore into the earth around him. Dirt sprayed across his face. Still he crawled. German infantry were now much closer, moving in short bursts toward positions where they could shoot down at the American sergeant. Culage began throwing grenades. Not at the tank. Grenades could not stop armor. He threw them at the infantry, at the German soldiers advancing behind the tanks, at the men who would soon overrun his machine gun crews if he failed to stop them. The explosions shattered the German advance. Soldiers dropped. Others dove for cover. The carefully coordinated attack that had begun with such confidence began to break apart. Culage threw grenade after grenade. Between throws he crawled forward, shortening the distance, making each blast more devastating. The Germans had expected the American position to collapse the moment tanks appeared. They had not expected one man to attack them. Behind Culage, his machine gun crews opened fire. The Brownings might have been useless against tanks, but they were still lethal against exposed infantry. Grenades exploding from the front and machine gun fire ripping from the hilltop created chaos in the German ranks. The infantry assault stalled. German soldiers hugged the ground, unwilling to advance into the storm of fragments and automatic fire. The tanks continued moving forward. But tanks without infantry support were suddenly far more vulnerable. Tanks without infantry support were vulnerable. Even heavy armored vehicles could be flanked, surrounded, and destroyed by determined soldiers using improvised tactics. The German commanders understood this immediately. Their infantry had been pinned down. The carefully coordinated assault had collapsed into chaos. And the American sergeant who should have died seconds after leaving his foxhole was still crawling forward through gunfire, still throwing grenades, still refusing to stop. But the mathematics of war had not changed. Eventually, Culage ran out of grenades. Behind him, the machine gun crews began firing their final belts of ammunition. The tanks were still advancing. And now the defenders of Hill 623 had nothing left to stop them. 4 days of combat had consumed every resource. Courage alone could not replace bullets. Culage made the decision that every commander dreads. He ordered a withdrawal. Not a panic. Not a rout. A disciplined movement to the rear. Each element would cover the others as they fell back through the forest, preserving order even as they abandoned the hill they had defended for 4 relentless days. The last man to leave Hill 623 was Technical Sergeant Charles Culage. The withdrawal was executed with remarkable precision considering the circumstances. Culage positioned himself at the rear of the column, carbine ready, watching for German pursuit as his men slipped through the fog-filled forest toward American lines. But the pursuit never came. The German force that had spent 4 days trying to capture a single hilltop had been battered too badly to follow. Their infantry had taken severe casualties. Their final assault with tank support had dissolved into confusion. By the time German commanders reorganized their troops, the Americans had vanished into the thick fog of the Vosges Mountains. Culage eventually led his men back to battalion headquarters. The result stunned everyone who heard the report. 12 soldiers had held Hill 623 for 96 hours against a reinforced German company supported by armored vehicles. They had repelled more than a dozen assaults. They had inflicted an estimated 50 to 60 enemy casualties, and not a single American had been killed. Several soldiers had been wounded during the fighting, but every one of them survived. They had continued fighting through their injuries, manning machine guns and holding their sectors, trusting the sergeant who had kept them alive when every tactical calculation said they should have been destroyed. Battalion headquarters had already assumed the position was lost. When radio contact failed on the first day, commanders concluded the small force had likely been killed or captured. Relief operations had even been considered, but rejected. The German strength in the sector made such a rescue too dangerous. The 12 men on Hill 623 had essentially been written off. Now they walked back into American lines. Exhausted, frozen, out of ammunition, but alive, every one of them. Word of the battle spread quickly throughout the 36th Infantry Division. Veteran officers who had fought across Italy and France immediately understood what had happened. Holding a position for 4 days against overwhelming odds was extraordinary. Holding it without losing a single man was almost unheard of. Within days, the recommendation for the Medal of Honor was initiated. But military bureaucracy moved slowly. Witness statements had to be collected. Reports had to be written. Each level of command had to approve the nomination before it could be sent to Washington. Months would pass before the final decision was made. Meanwhile, Culage remained on the front lines. Army regulations normally required that Medal of Honor nominees be removed from combat. The military preferred not to risk losing a potential recipient before the award could be presented. But no one told Culage, and no one enforced the regulation. He continued fighting through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. The 36th Division pushed through the Vosges Mountains, crossed into Germany, and advanced toward the collapsing Third Reich. Culage was present for all of it. Earlier in the war, he had even been offered a battlefield commission, a promotion to lieutenant that would have formally recognized his leadership. He declined. He had entered the army as an enlisted soldier, and he intended to leave the same way. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on June 18, 1945, at a bomb-damaged airfield near Dornstadt, Germany. The war in Europe had ended only 5 weeks earlier. Lieutenant General Wade Hayslip presented the medal. Culage was still only 23 years old. The official citation described the events on Hill 623. For days of continuous combat, leadership of inexperienced soldiers under relentless attack, the advance toward German tanks with a malfunctioning bazooka, the grenade assault that shattered the final enemy offensive, and the disciplined withdrawal that preserved every man under his command. The medal itself was a bronze 5-pointed star suspended from a pale blue ribbon, the same decoration awarded since the Civil War for acts performed above and beyond the call of duty. Culage wore it for the official photographs. Then he packed it away. He never considered himself a hero. He believed he had simply done what the situation demanded. His men needed leadership. He gave it. The outcome could easily have been different. The bazooka might have worked. The German tanks might have overrun the hill. He might have died there like thousands of other sergeants who fell across Europe. But the war was over now. Charles Culage wanted only one thing: to go home to Tennessee. He returned to Signal Mountain in the autumn of 1945. He resumed work at Chattanooga Printing and Engraving, the family business where he had learned bookbinding as a teenager. He married. He raised a family. The Medal of Honor recipient became a printer. For the rest of his life, Culage rarely spoke about the war. When people asked about Hill 623, he redirected the attention to the men who had fought beside him. 12 soldiers had held that hill. 12 soldiers had endured 4 days of combat without rest. The medal around his neck, he said, represented their effort, not his. Years passed. The veterans of the 36th Division held reunions that grew smaller with each passing decade as age claimed the men who had survived Salerno, Anzio, and the Vosges. Culage attended when he could. Soldiers remembered the sergeant who had walked calmly through German gunfire as if it could not touch him. Recognition slowly accumulated. In 1989, a 9-mile section of U.S. Route 27 in Hamilton County, Tennessee was renamed the Charles H. Culage Medal of Honor Highway. In 1999, the city of Chattanooga opened Culage Park along the Tennessee River. 13 acres of public space, walking paths, river overlooks, a restored carousel, a park named for a man who had never sought fame. France also remembered. In 2006, 62 years after the battle for Hill 623, the French government awarded Culage the Legion of Honor, their highest decoration. The medal was presented to an 85-year-old veteran who had helped liberate their country when he was barely old enough to vote. In February 2020, the Charles H. Culage Medal of Honor Heritage Center opened in downtown Chattanooga, a museum dedicated to preserving the stories of Medal of Honor recipients and teaching future generations about service and sacrifice. Culage attended the opening ceremony. He was 98 years old. By then, he was one of only 2 living Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. The generation that had fought across Europe and the Pacific was disappearing. Hundreds of veterans were dying every day. Each death took memories that could never be replaced. Each funeral closed another chapter of history. Charles Culage died on April 6, 2021. He was 99 years old. His passing left only one living World War II Medal of Honor recipient, the final living link to a conflict that had reshaped the modern world. For 76 years after Hill 623, Culage watched the world change. He saw his country fight wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He saw new generations of soldiers earn the same medal that once hung quietly in his closet. Whenever someone asked how he had survived 4 days against overwhelming German forces, his answer never changed. He hadn't been thinking about himself. He had been thinking about his men, 12 soldiers on a hilltop in France. A sergeant who refused to let them die. A position that should have fallen in hours, but held for 4 days. Historians still ask the same question. What separates the men who run from the men who stay? Charles Culage never claimed to know the answer. He only knew what he did when the moment came.